What if I told you that hamburgers and Coca-Cola could break enemy soldiers faster than any torture? That a simple meal could shatter everything they believed about their enemy? This is that incredible true story. Picture this. It's 1944, and dozens of Japanese soldiers are stepping off a train in the freezing cold of Wisconsin. But here's the thing, they're not there to fight. They're prisoners of war, and they're absolutely terrified. These men had been taught one simple rule their entire military lives. Capture was worse than death. Being taken prisoner meant shame so deep it would follow you forever. They'd been told horror stories about what Americans would do to them. Torture, starvation, humiliation, the works. So when those train doors opened at Camp McCoy, these soldiers expected to die. They prepared themselves for the worst. Instead, what they saw completely confused them. The camp looked organized, clean even. There were barracks, guard towers, and barbed wire. Sure, that's what you'd expect. But something felt different. Smoke was rising from kitchen chimneys, carrying the smell of real food. Not the watery soup they'd been surviving on, but something rich and hearty. Here's what really shocked them. Red Cross officials were standing there with clipboards, watching everything. Back home, they'd been told Americans ignored all international laws. They were supposed to be lawless barbarians. Yet here were neutral observers making sure rules were followed. The intake process was unlike anything they expected. Instead of beatings, they got medical checkups. Instead of being left to rot with their injuries, American medics actually cleaned their wounds and gave them fresh bandages. One soldier sat frozen as an enemy. Medic carefully tended to his infected arm. He couldn't understand it. Why would they help him? Why would they do this? One prisoner whispered to another in disbelief. "We are not their men. We are nothing." But the surprises were just beginning. After processing, the men were marched to their quarters. The snow crunched under their feet, and the Wisconsin cold cut through their thin uniforms. But when they got inside the barracks, they found something they never expected: warmth. The buildings were heated with stoves. Real wool blankets were stacked on the bunks. The mattresses weren't luxurious, but they were soft, softer than anything these soldiers had slept on in months of jungle warfare. Some prisoners sat down carefully on the beds, pressing their palms into the mattresses as if the softness might disappear if they pushed too hard. Outside, the barbed wire still reminded them this was captivity. But inside, this felt nothing like the dungeon they'd prepared for. All their lives, they'd been told that capture meant being treated like animals. That surrender stripped away all dignity. But here at Camp McCoy, guards were helping sick prisoners stay steady on their feet. Medics were carefully wrapping wounds. Red Cross representatives were checking that food was distributed fairly. The prisoners didn't relax, not yet. Suspicion lived in their chests like a second heartbeat. But as night fell and they lay under real blankets for the first time in forever, they couldn't help but wonder, what if everything they'd been told about their enemy was wrong? Here's where our story gets really incredible. What happened in that mess hall would haunt these men for the rest of their lives. The next morning, the prisoners woke not to screaming guards or brutal punishment, but to a bugle call. For a moment, some forgot where they were. It sounded just like the morning calls in their own camps back in Japan. But then reality hit as English voices echoed outside. They were ordered into formation and marched toward the mess hall. Fear sat heavy in their chests. Many expected they'd be given scraps unfit for animals, if they were fed at all. Hunger had been their constant companion for months. In the Pacific, meals had dwindled to bowls of watery rice, sometimes barley, and if they were incredibly lucky, a few pickled vegetables. Meat was practically mythical. Sugar? They'd almost forgotten it existed. The line moved slowly as the prisoners shuffled forward, clutching their metal trays like shields. Steam rose from behind the counter, carrying a scent so foreign they couldn't even identify it. It was rich, heavy, smoky, definitely meat, but unlike the dried fish they once ate at home. Then came the moment that would break them. The first soldier stepped up to the counter. An American cook, sleeves rolled up, dropped a hot meat patty onto a soft bun with his spatula. He added fried potatoes on the side, golden, crispy, more food than this man had seen in one place for months. Finally, the cook reached for a glass bottle sweating with condensation, popped the cap with a sharp hiss, and slid it onto the tray. The Japanese soldier stared at the tray as if it were a mirage. His hands trembled. The red script on the bottle was completely unfamiliar, almost decorative. "Move along," the cook said flatly, already preparing the next tray. The prisoner shuffled forward, still staring in disbelief. Behind him, whispers rippled through the line. "Meat. They're giving us meat." What happened next would stay with these men forever. The prisoners sat at long wooden tables, eyeing their food with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hunger. Some brought the strange bottle, Coca-Cola, a guard had explained, to their lips. The sweetness exploded first, then the sharp burn of carbonation hit their throats. Some gagged and coughed from the shock. Others' eyes went wide with astonishment. One man actually laughed, an uncontrolled burst that startled everyone around him. Another covered his mouth and lowered his head, shoulders shaking, caught somewhere between laughter and tears. A thin soldier, his ribs visible even under his new uniform, lifted his hamburger with both hands as if it might fall apart. He sniffed it carefully, then took a bite. Grease ran down his chin. He froze, chewing slowly, as if each bite might vanish if he moved too quickly. Then he lowered his face, unable to hide the tears welling up. "Are you all right?" his friend asked quietly. The man swallowed hard. "I had forgotten the taste of fat." At another table, two prisoners debated in hushed whispers. "They want to make us weak," one argued. "They fatten us so we forget our cause," his companion replied slowly. Or, "They simply eat like this every day." That idea was harder to swallow than the food itself. And here's what made this situation so mind-blowing. This wasn't some special feast meant to impress the prisoners. To the Americans, this was just Tuesday dinner. The mess hall filled with quiet sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, an occasional sob quickly hidden. For men who had lived through the starvation of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Japan's failing supply lines, this meal was more than food. It was an assault on everything they believed. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate that the sweetness of Coca-Cola felt like a dream gone wrong, too gentle to belong in war. The Americans serving the food noticed nothing extraordinary. They ate the same hamburgers and fries, washed them down with the same Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was just procedure. But for the prisoners themselves, it was like crossing into another reality. What shook them most wasn't the abundance. It was how normal it all seemed to the Americans. They weren't celebrating or taunting. This wasn't a feast meant to show off. It was simply routine. Here were men who'd been told America was starving, decadent, on the brink of collapse. Yet in captivity, they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the empire. The shame was sharp, but the relief was sharper. By the time trays were emptied and bottles stood drained on the tables, the prisoners sat back in stunned silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer. Others stared blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. That night, lying on bunks under wool blankets, the memory of hamburgers and Coca-Cola stayed with them, not just as food, but as proof. Proof that their enemy lived in a completely different world. One where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners. One where meat was so common it could be shaped into patties and handed out without a second thought. But wait, if you think this story is just about food, you're in for another surprise. What happened next challenged everything these men thought they knew about captivity, enemy, and human nature itself. The shock of that first meal lingered, but it didn't erase the reality of captivity. Each morning, prisoners of war at Camp McCoy woke to roll call, boots crunching in the frost, rifles pointed down from guard towers. The barbed wire was always there, cutting across the horizon like a scar. Inside the wire, routine ruled everything. After breakfast, prisoners were divided into work groups. Some shoveled snow from roads, others cut wood. Still others helped on nearby farms under guard supervision. Here's what surprised them. The work wasn't brutal. They weren't being used to exhaustion. Instead, they were paid small wages in camp coupons, which could be exchanged for items at the camp store, toiletries, writing paper, even candy or cigarettes. One afternoon, a Japanese soldier held up a chocolate bar he'd purchased with his earnings. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. In Japan, he murmured to a fellow prisoner, "This is medicine. Here they give it away to soldiers like it's nothing." The camp store itself was another shock. Prisoners watched American soldiers come and go, chatting casually, buying Coke or chewing gum, joking with the clerk. The casualness of it was almost unbearable. War was raging across Europe and the Pacific, yet here in Wisconsin, Americans seemed to live as though abundance would never run dry. The daily structure of camp life pressed down in a different way. There was no fighting, no advancing, no dying comrades to bury. Instead, there was monotony. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. The mind, once consumed by survival, now had space to wander. Letters became lifelines. The camp allowed each prisoner to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, heavily censored but still precious. Men hunched over tables, scratching out words with pencils, trying to capture their homes in ink. "I am alive" was often all they could manage. Some received letters back, thin envelopes with familiar handwriting. Others received none. For those men, silence grew heavier with each passing week. English classes were offered in the evenings. A few curious prisoners attended, repeating words slowly after the American teacher: bread, table, window. Others scoffed, insisting there was no use in learning the enemy's language. But even the skeptics listened from their bunks, ears picking up the strange rhythm of the words. There were moments of unexpected contact. A guard at a work site once asked a prisoner, "Do you miss rice?" The interpreter relayed the question. The prisoner laughed bitterly and answered in Japanese, "Rice is a memory." When the reply was translated, the guard grew quiet, perhaps realizing the weight behind those words. Now here's where this story takes another incredible turn. Despite all the rules and regulations, something beautiful and confusing began to happen between these enemies. For weeks, the camp ran like clockwork. Guards gave orders. Prisoners followed. Meals came on schedule. The rhythm was predictable, even dull. But in between those routines, small cracks opened where humanity slipped through. Moments that neither side could have imagined when the war began. It often started with language. Few Japanese prisoners spoke English beyond a handful of words, and most Americans knew no Japanese at all. Commands were given through interpreters or gestures, yet necessity pushed both sides to improvise. A guard might point at a shovel and bark, "Work." A prisoner, catching the sound, would repeat it awkwardly under his breath, "Whack." Soon others did the same, laughing quietly at their clumsy attempts. During one English class, an American instructor wrote the word "family" on the chalkboard. He asked for a volunteer to say it aloud. A prisoner stood, hesitated, then said, "Family." The class burst into laughter, not cruel, but genuine. Even the teacher smiled. The prisoner smiled too, his face softening for the first time in weeks. In that instant, the label of enemy gave way to something more ordinary: men trying to bridge a gap. Food became a kind of common ground. On rare occasions, guards shared cigarettes or chewing gum with prisoners during work details. The gum baffled the Japanese completely. One man chewed for a few minutes, then swallowed it whole. The Americans roared with laughter, shaking their heads, trying to explain through gestures that you weren't supposed to eat it. Soon gum became a small symbol of exchange, a guard offering, a prisoner accepting with a stiff bow. But not all encounters were friendly. And what happened next shows just how complicated this situation really was. There were clashes too. On a farm outside the camp where prisoners worked clearing fields, an American farmer watched them with hatred burning in his eyes. His son had been killed in the Pacific, and resentment boiled over in his stare. When one prisoner bent to pick up a dropped tool, the farmer spat on the ground near his feet. The guard escorting the work crew noticed, but said nothing, just walked closer. The tension hung in the cold air, unspoken but raw. The farmer turned away, muttering, "Should have left them to starve." That moment spread quickly among the prisoners when they returned to camp. "Not all Americans follow their rules," one said grimly. His bunkmate replied, "Of course not. They are men like us. Some will hate, some will not." Inside the wire, friendships sometimes grew where no one expected them. A young guard named Miller, barely 20 with a soft Illinois accent, often lingered near the barracks after duty. He carried photographs of his family, showing them to prisoners who gathered near the fence. They didn't understand his words, but they understood the faces: a mother, a father, 2 small sisters. In turn, prisoners traced shapes in the dirt, sketching their own homes, their villages, their wives waiting oceans away. It wasn't dialogue in words, but dialogue in images. One evening, Miller managed to say slowly, "Mother, father." He pointed to the photos. A prisoner nodded, touched his chest, and said in Japanese, "Haha, Chichi, Suma." The exchange lasted only moments before another guard ordered Miller away, but the seed was planted. They had spoken across the chasm, if only for an instant. Here's where this story gets really heavy and really human. Culture ran deep, and suspicion ran deeper. Among the Japanese, loyalty to the emperor wasn't erased by hamburgers or Coca-Cola. Some men whispered warnings against softening. They accused fellow prisoners who attended English classes of betraying their honor. In the dim light of the barracks, arguments flared. Was survival worth adaptation? Did every borrowed word, every moment of laughter with a guard, chip away at who they were? One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, "We were told Americans were animals, yet they share their gum. They heal our wounds. Which is the lie? Which is the truth?" The contradictions gnawed at them. For some, the kindness of guards felt like humiliation, a reminder that they lived better as captives than their families did back home. For others, those same moments hinted at something uncomfortable but undeniable. The enemy was not faceless. One snowy night, as lights flickered out across the camp, a prisoner whispered to his bunkmate, "If we survive this war, what will we tell our children? That our enemy fed us? That he gave us blankets? That he smiled at us?" The bunkmate stayed silent for a long time before answering softly, "We will tell them the truth, even if it shames us." Now imagine getting a letter from home that makes you feel guilty for being alive. That's exactly what happened next. By winter 1945, the contradictions had grown almost unbearable. Every night, debates flared in the barracks. Some argued fiercely that this was all deception, that America only pretended to treat prisoners well to weaken them, to steal their spirit. One man stood up one night, voice harsh, "Do not be fooled. Our emperor demands strength, not comfort. Every hamburger you swallow is a betrayal." Others, weary of suffering, pushed back, "We are alive. And if survival is betrayal, then what did dying hungry on Saipan achieve?" Silence followed those words. Silence and shame. Letters from home made the contradictions sting even sharper. When a prisoner received word that his family in Osaka survived on boiled weeds and scraps of barley, he held the paper in shaking hands while the smell of roast beef drifted from the mess hall. "I eat like a king," he confessed quietly, "while my children starve." It wasn't only food. Warmth itself became a symbol of guilt. In barracks heated by stoves with wool blankets and sturdy boots, the men remembered families shivering in wooden houses with glass shattered from air raids. Captivity offered them safety, yet deepened their shame. Some prisoners clung harder to propaganda, repeating it like prayers. America was decadent, hollow, ready to collapse. But the evidence around them mocked those words. Coca-Cola bottles arrived by the crate. Cigarettes were available not just for soldiers, but for prisoners. Work crews saw American farmers with tractors, barns full of livestock, fields that seemed endless. Abundance here wasn't fantasy. It was normal. One guard, overhearing a prisoner remark on the overflowing fields, said simply, "This is only Wisconsin. You should see Illinois." The prisoner lowered his eyes, ashamed of the envy burning in him. And then something happened that broke these hardened soldiers in a way no battle ever had. The contradictions broke some men quietly. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears, "I believe Japan was the center of the world. But now I see, perhaps we are only one small island." His bunkmate scolded him, warned him never to speak such treason aloud. But the thought had been voiced, and thoughts cannot be taken back. Perhaps the most painful contradiction came during Red Cross inspections. Officials asked the prisoners if they were treated well. Most answered yes, because it was true. But afterward, in the barracks, shame swept over them. "We admit our enemy treats us fairly while our own nation cannot feed us. What does that make us?" No one had an answer. One snowy afternoon, a work crew was clearing a road outside the camp when a group of American children approached. They were curious, bold, their cheeks red from the cold. One girl held out a candy bar, offering it through the wire to a Japanese prisoner. He froze. He had faced bombs, bullets, hunger. But the innocent gesture of a child terrified him more than any weapon. Slowly, he took the candy, bowed low, and said in halting English, "Thank you." The girl smiled and skipped back to her friends. That night, The man confessed to his bunkmates that he felt more broken by that small kindness than by all the battles he had endured. "A child of the enemy," he whispered, "gave me food with a smile. How can I hate her?" Such moments left scars of confusion. They didn't erase loyalty to the emperor, nor did they end the war inside their hearts. But they made the line between friend and foe blurrier than propaganda ever admitted. By summer 1945, everything these men thought they knew about the world was about to crumble completely. The world outside Camp McCoy had shifted beyond recognition. Whispers turned to headlines in American newspapers that prisoners occasionally glimpsed through guards or Red Cross officials. The Allies were advancing in Europe. Cities in Japan were burning under waves of bombers. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck, rumors raced through the camp faster than guards could silence them. Most prisoners didn't fully understand what an atomic bomb was, but horror bled through every word. Then came the truth they couldn't ignore. Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell over the camp like a weight no one could lift. Some prisoners stared blankly at the ground. Others wept in silence, shoulders shaking under thin blankets. For years they had carried the belief that their nation could not fall, that death was preferable to defeat. Now defeat had arrived while they were behind barbed wire, unable to lift a weapon, unable to choose their fate. Days passed in strange quiet. The guards didn't gloat. They simply carried on with routines, meals, roll calls, inspections. For many prisoners, that steadiness was unbearable. "They treat us the same," one man whispered bitterly. "Whether we are warriors or defeated, do they not see our shame?" But the camp was already preparing for repatriation. The Red Cross began organizing lists, transportation routes, schedules. Prisoners were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and briefings about the journey ahead. They would be shipped back across the Pacific, not as soldiers of a victorious empire, but as survivors of a war their nation had lost. What happened when these men finally returned to Japan would haunt them forever. The departure wasn't triumphant. On the morning of transfer, prisoners filed out of their barracks carrying small bundles of belongings. Some clutched wooden carvings made during idle hours. Others carried carefully folded letters from home, stained with tears and sweat. As they passed through the gates, many glanced back one last time at the camp that had held them. It wasn't fondness that moved them, but confusion. The place where they'd expected cruelty had instead given them hamburgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, and glimpses of kindness. The journey home was long and heavy. On the ship, men huddled together, wondering what awaited them in Japan. Cities were gone, families scattered, hunger worse than when they'd left. They worried about being branded cowards, despised for having lived as prisoners. The guilt was sharp, but so was another memory they couldn't forget: the taste of that first meal in Camp McCoy. One man, scribbling in a worn notebook, wrote, "I thought my enemy would break me with violence. Instead, he broke me with food. I cannot erase the taste of bread, meat, and sweetness. It will follow me home like a shadow." When the prisoners finally stepped onto Japanese soil, reality struck hard. Bombed ruins stretched where cities once stood. Families met them with tears, relief, and sometimes bitterness. Some wives and children had survived on grass and tree bark. Others hadn't survived at all. The returning prisoners faced accusations of weakness, of dishonor. But in their silence, they carried stories no one at home wanted to hear. Stories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola, of Americans who treated them by rules instead of rage. And here's the most incredible part: how these men carried this secret for the rest of their lives. In the years that followed, a few spoke cautiously about their time in America. They admitted it had forced them to see the enemy not as monsters, but as men. Others never spoke at all, burying the memories under layers of duty and shame. Yet, even in silence, the contradictions lived on. One prisoner told his son years later, "I learned in America that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can fight, kindness you remember." The legacy of Camp McCoy and camps like it isn't found in battles or victories, but in those quiet, disorienting moments when food, kindness, and order collided with fear and loyalty. For the prisoners, captivity revealed something uncomfortable but undeniable. Humanity could exist even in the middle of war. Hashtag chapter 16. The lesson that outlasted war *. So what does this incredible story teach us? Why does it matter today, decades after the last shot was fired. Asterisk, perhaps the final lesson is this: wars end, nations rise and fall. But the small choices, a guard sharing a photograph, a child offering candy, a cook sliding a hamburger across a counter, can leave marks that outlast the noise of cannons. For those Japanese prisoners, the taste of Coca-Cola and the grease of a hamburger became symbols of contradiction, but also of survival. They reminded the men that even enemies can show mercy, and that sometimes mercy cuts deeper than hatred. The prisoners who lived through Camp McCoy learned something their leaders never taught them: that their enemy was not a faceless monster, but human beings capable of both cruelty and kindness. This lesson was more devastating than any battle, because it forced them to question everything they'd been told about the war, about their enemy, and about themselves. In the mess halls of Wisconsin, over trays of food they'd never imagined, these men discovered that propaganda could lie, that enemies could show compassion, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, it's simple human decency. War can strip men of everything: their homes, their families, their beliefs, their pride. But it cannot erase the power of small acts of humanity: a warm meal offered without hatred, medical care given to those who would have been left to die, blankets provided to keep enemies warm. These acts don't erase the horror of war. They don't justify the conflict or minimize the suffering. But they prove something crucial: that even in the darkest hours, humans can choose compassion over cruelty, order over chaos, mercy over revenge. Years later, when these men were old and gray, when the war had become history, what did they remember most? Not the battles, not the bombs, not even the surrender. They remembered the taste of their first hamburger, the shock of cold Coca-Cola bubbling down their throats, the weight of a wool blanket on a Wisconsin night, the sound of a child's laughter through barbed wire. These memories stayed with them because they represented something beyond the war itself. They represented the moment when their understanding of the world changed forever, when enemy became human, when hatred met kindness and didn't know what to do. The story of Camp McCoy and the Japanese prisoners who broke down after tasting hamburgers and Coca-Cola isn't really about food at all. It's about the discovery that our enemies are more like us than we want to admit. It's about the power of treating people with dignity, even when they're supposed to be your sworn enemies. It's about the moment when everything you thought you knew about the world crumbles, and you're left with nothing but the truth. That kindness can be more powerful than hatred, that mercy can be more devastating than cruelty, and that sometimes the most human thing you can do is share your food with someone who was taught to kill you. In the end, the hamburgers and Coca-Cola didn't just feed hungry bodies. They fed hungry souls who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as human beings. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful weapon of all. The taste of humanity, once experienced, can never be forgotten. It follows you home like a shadow, reminding you that even in war, even at our worst, we have the capacity to choose who we want to be. These Japanese prisoners learned that lesson in the most unexpected place, not on a battlefield, but in a mess hall in Wisconsin, over a tray of food served by their enemies. And that lesson, bitter and sweet like the Coca-Cola that started it all, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. War teaches us to hate, but sometimes, if we're very lucky, it also teaches us to hope. This story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, small acts of kindness can light the way forward. What we choose to do with our enemies says more about who we are than how we treat our friends. The taste of that first hamburger, the fizz of that first Coca-Cola. These simple pleasures became symbols of something much larger. They became proof that compassion can exist even in captivity, that mercy can be found even in the midst of war, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating your enemy like a human being. In our world today, filled with its own conflicts and divisions, perhaps we can learn something from those Wisconsin winters of 1944 and 1945. Perhaps we can remember that behind every enemy is a person with a family, with hopes and fears, with the same basic needs for food and warmth and dignity that we all share. The Japanese prisoners who broke down after tasting American food didn't just discover the abundance of their enemy. They discovered their own humanity reflected back at them. And in that reflection, they found something more powerful than any weapon: the understanding that we are all, in the end, just human beings trying to survive in a world that often seems determined to tear us apart. That understanding, born in a prison camp in Wisconsin over hamburgers and Coca-Cola, might just be the most important lesson of the entire war.